On the morning of April 7th at precisely 5:43 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Reuters published a 7,000-word investigative report documenting what defense officials in 4 separate countries had been working to keep classified for the previous 18 months. The report detailed a comprehensive military intelligence sharing agreement between the United States and Iran, formalized through back-channel diplomatic protocols in October of the previous year. Within 6 hours of publication, the State Department issued 3 separate denials. Within 12 hours, satellite imagery analysts had confirmed every major claim the Reuters investigation made. By the time markets closed that evening, the geopolitical assumptions that had structured Middle Eastern security policy for 43 years were no longer operational. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications before going any further. What Reuters documented this morning is not simply a diplomatic scandal. It is a fundamental restructuring of regional power architecture whose consequences will compound for years, regardless of what official statements attempt to characterize as isolated cooperation. The pace at which the operational picture is diverging from official communications means you cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next development breaks. The evidence is already accumulating faster than institutional frameworks can process it. To understand the full weight of what Reuters revealed, it is necessary to first understand what this intelligence sharing agreement actually represents to regional security calculations, because this was not a temporary tactical arrangement formed in response to immediate crisis. It was a systematic institutional framework built to sustain long-term coordination on threats both parties identified as existential regardless of their ongoing adversarial posture on other fronts. The agreement established protocols for sharing satellite reconnaissance data on Islamic State operations across 7 countries, created secure communication channels between CENTCOM forward operating bases and Iranian Revolutionary Guard regional commands, and implemented joint targeting procedures for counter-terrorism operations in areas where both nations maintained active military presence. The framework included technical specifications for data transmission security, established verification procedures to prevent intelligence manipulation, and created dispute resolution mechanisms for situations where shared intelligence produced contradictory tactical recommendations. According to the Reuters investigation, the agreement was not negotiated through traditional diplomatic channels, but through a dedicated working group that met 17 times across neutral locations in Oman and Switzerland over 14 months. That operational timeline places the first substantive meetings 3 months before public statements from both governments were describing relations as reaching historic lows. The repair work required to reconcile official narrative with documented reality will take substantially longer than the 18 months this agreement operated in classified status. Every public statement characterizing Iranian military operations as uniformly threatening to American interests must now be re-examined against the possibility that those operations were occurring with American intelligence support. Every American military deployment described as countering Iranian influence must be analyzed for whether it was actually protecting joint operational objectives both nations had agreed to pursue. The entire framework of threat assessment that structured defense appropriations, alliance commitments, and strategic positioning across the Middle East was operating on incomplete information while this agreement remained classified. Official framing cannot be updated retroactively, but operational reality has already moved forward, incorporating 18 months of coordination that public understanding is only now beginning to process. Now to the question that defense policy analysts across ideological divides are already examining with urgent attention: why did both governments work so systematically to keep this agreement classified when the security benefits it generated would have strengthened justification for continued engagement? The agreement was not a covert operation conducted without proper authorization. According to Reuters, it received formal approval from relevant oversight mechanisms in both countries, operated within legal frameworks governing intelligence cooperation, and generated documented security outcomes that both governments internally assessed as successful. The classification was not protecting illegality, it was protecting political viability. Both governments had concluded that their domestic political environments could not sustain public knowledge of cooperation, even when that cooperation was producing measurable security benefits. The strategic calculation was that voters in both countries would reject the policy if they understood it, so the policy would operate more effectively if voters did not understand it. The technical architecture of the intelligence sharing system reveals the sophistication of coordination that was occurring beneath public adversarial posturing. The agreement established what intelligence analysts term a segregated access protocol, where information was transmitted through systems physically isolated from standard classified networks to prevent accidental disclosure through routine intelligence distribution. Data was encrypted using what cryptographic specialists identify as asymmetric key infrastructure, where each transmission required unique authentication codes generated by quantum random number systems to prevent interception or spoofing. The transmission infrastructure itself operated through commercial satellite bandwidth leased under corporate identities that appeared to have no government affiliation, routing data through server networks in countries with privacy laws that prevented disclosure even under legal pressure. According to technical documentation Reuters obtained, the system was engineered to leave no forensic evidence of the intelligence source even if the data itself was captured, allowing both governments plausible deniability if cooperation became publicly exposed before they chose to acknowledge it. If this channel is giving you the analysis this situation deserves, the kind that explains mechanisms rather than just reporting events, subscribe now and share this video with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening behind the daily headline cycle. When the next revelation about coordination emerges, when the next contradiction between public statements and documented operations becomes impossible to ignore, when institutional frameworks begin acknowledging what operational reality has already incorporated, the analysis will be here. The operational question now facing both governments is whether continuation of intelligence sharing remains viable once public knowledge has eliminated the political protection that classifications provided. The agreement generated documented results that both intelligence communities assessed as strategically valuable. Islamic State operational capacity in areas covered by joint targeting declined by 68% during the 18 months the agreement was active, according to threat assessment data Reuters obtained from 3 separate intelligence agencies. Cross-border smuggling of weapons-grade materials that both nations identified as proliferation threats decreased by 41% across monitored transit routes. Early warning indicators for mass casualty attacks improved by timelines ranging from 48 to 96 hours in regions where both nations maintained surveillance infrastructure. These are not speculative benefits subject to analytical interpretation. They are quantified security improvements that occurred during the period when coordination was active, and that both governments internally attributed to intelligence sharing even while publicly characterizing each other as security threats. The economic consequences of what is happening diplomatically have now reached a scale that extends beyond regional security calculations and into the daily economic reality of people in countries with no direct involvement in Middle Eastern conflicts. Understanding the specific mechanisms by which this revelation is generating those consequences is essential to understanding why they will not resolve quickly, even if both governments issue clarifying statements tomorrow. Energy markets responded to the Reuters investigation within minutes of publication, with crude oil futures dropping 4.7% in early trading before recovering 2.1% by market close. That volatility was not driven by changes in physical supply availability but by recalculation of geopolitical risk premiums that had assumed American-Iranian military confrontation remained the baseline scenario for Middle Eastern security. Insurance actuaries who calculate war risk coverage for commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz had priced their policies on probability assessments that assumed zero coordination between American-Iranian military operations in the region. That assumption is no longer tenable. The actuarial mathematics of war risk insurance do not adjust gradually to new information. They recalibrate completely when fundamental assumptions prove invalid. The weekly economic cost of repricing risk across energy markets, shipping insurance, and regional investment portfolios is currently estimated between $12 and $18 billion, according to financial analysis from 3 major investment banks. That figure represents not the cost of changed physical conditions but purely the cost of uncertainty as market participants recalibrate expectations about how Middle Eastern security actually operates versus how official statements have characterized it. Tourism and business travel sectors dependent on regional stability are experiencing booking cancellations running at 7 to 11% above seasonal baselines as corporate risk assessment departments revise travel authorization policies to account for the possibility that their previous understanding of which areas were secure was based on incomplete information. Foreign direct investment commitments to regional development projects have declined by approximately 23% in the 5 days since Reuters published, not because project fundamentals have changed, but because investors are reassessing whether they can reliably predict government behavior when official statements have proven systematically misleading about cooperation that was occurring for 18 months. The broader strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is one that defense policy specialists across political divides are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. If two governments can sustain systematic military coordination for 18 months while publicly maintaining adversarial postures, what other aspects of the international security architecture are operating on premises that official statements do not accurately describe? The revelation is not simply about American-Iranian relations. It is about the reliability of public characterizations of international relationships generally. If these two nations were coordinating on counter-terrorism while publicly threatening military confrontation over nuclear programs, shipping interdictions, and regional proxy conflicts, the implication is that official threat assessments may be performing political functions domestically rather than accurately describing security conditions internationally. That possibility creates analytical paralysis for anyone attempting to assess actual security risks based on official government communications. Both governments are projecting that this revelation represents isolated cooperation on a narrow security issue rather than indicating broader systematic coordination. The documented evidence suggests something considerably more complicated. The most comprehensive intelligence sharing agreement between the United States and Iran since the 1970s arrived during the same period when both governments were publicly describing relations as approaching military confrontation. That contradiction may be the most revealing data point about how 21st century geopolitical competition actually operates versus how official frameworks characterize it. Nations that are genuine adversaries do not invest 14 months negotiating detailed intelligence-sharing protocols, do not establish quantum encrypted communication channels, do not create joint targeting procedures, and do not sustain 18 months of operational coordination while simultaneously preparing for military conflict. The behavior reveals either that the adversarial posture was theatrical, or that both governments have concluded that selective cooperation on specific threats can coexist with sustained competition on other issues in ways that previous strategic frameworks assumed were impossible. The technical success of the intelligence sharing system created operational dependencies that will complicate any attempt to terminate cooperation now that classification has been eliminated. American intelligence collection on Islamic State operations in areas of Syria where Iranian-aligned forces maintain control became dependent on data Iranian sources provided through the agreement. Iranian early warning systems for detecting weapons smuggling across Iraqi borders incorporated American satellite reconnaissance that Iranian indigenous systems cannot replicate. Both intelligence architectures adapted over 18 months to incorporate capabilities the agreement provided, making sudden termination operationally disruptive regardless of political pressure to demonstrate that cooperation has ended. The strategic logic is that intelligence agencies on both sides now depend on continuation, even if political leadership decides cooperation must cease to satisfy domestic constituencies demanding accountability for the deception. The institutional question both governments now face is whether democratic accountability mechanisms can function effectively when security policies operate successfully only if voters do not understand them. The agreement generated documented security benefits that both governments assessed as valuable enough to justify elaborate classification systems preventing public knowledge. The implication is that both governments concluded their populations would reject effective security policy if they understood how it actually worked. So effective policy required systematic deception about what was occurring. That logic creates fundamental tension between democratic governance principles requiring informed consent and security imperatives that officials believe require operational secrecy even when operations are legal, authorized, and successful. The Reuters investigation has not resolved this tension but has made it impossible to ignore. Here is where the complete picture stands on day 5 after Reuters published their investigation. Two governments that have maintained public adversarial postures for 43 years operated a systematic intelligence sharing agreement for 18 months while keeping it classified from their own populations. The agreement generated quantified security improvements including 68% reduction in Islamic State operational capacity, 41% decrease in weapons proliferation, and 48 to 96-hour improvements in attack warning timelines. Both governments chose to classify these successes rather than use them to justify cooperation publicly, concluding that political viability required secrecy even when policy was legal and effective. Markets responded to revelation of this coordination by repricing Middle Eastern geopolitical risk, generating $12 to $18 billion in weekly economic costs purely from uncertainty as participants recalibrate expectations. Both intelligence architectures have now adapted to incorporate capabilities the agreement provided, creating operational dependencies that will complicate termination regardless of political pressure. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. When the next documentation of systematic coordination that official statements have not acknowledged reaches public exposure, when the next fundamental assumption about adversarial relationships proves inaccurate, when institutional frameworks begin acknowledging that 21st century competition operates on principles that previous strategic doctrines did not anticipate, the analysis will be here. Evidence first. What it means for you always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can intelligence cooperation between declared adversaries remain effective once classification is eliminated, or does public knowledge fundamentally change the strategic calculations that made coordination viable when it operated in secrecy? Every response gets read and considered. This is where accountability meets operational reality.